General Vo Nguyen Giap once observed that if the number of B-52 aircraft lost in 1972 was only between 1 and 2%, the United States could have sustained the effort. However, if the loss rate reached between 6 and 7%, it would have shaken the White House. And if the rate exceeded 10%, the US would have been forced to officially surrender. Indeed, this prediction came true at the campaign's conclusion. The total number of B-52 aircraft shot down by Vietnamese anti-aircraft and air forces was 34 out of 193, a loss rate of 17.6%, which profoundly impacted the United States and compelled it to cease bombing and negotiate the Paris Peace Accords, signed on January 27, 1973. These are achievements that perhaps no other country in the world could have accomplished, except for a small and resource-limited nation like Vietnam. To achieve this, their intelligence operatives worked tirelessly for nearly a decade to understand the operational mechanics of the B-52 aircraft and to learn the communication language of the pilots post-1968. Recognizing the devastating power of the B-52, Vietnamese troops immediately deployed intelligence efforts to gather information about it. At that time, however, most Vietnamese soldiers primarily spoke French. To understand the intricacies of this American toy, they needed to learn English. Consequently, Vietnam selected its most talented individuals, those with the best educational foundations and a superior aptitude for learning foreign languages, to undertake additional English studies. This was crucial because, while learning conversational English might be straightforward, mastering technical English to read B-52 documentation and comprehend the jargon used by pilots was a much more formidable challenge. To understand what American pilots were saying to each other, mere proficiency in English was insufficient because the pilots used their own codes and jargon, only known amongst themselves. Sometimes they used slang, other times numbers, and occasionally signals, similar to how reporters might communicate in shorthand that is clear to insiders, but opaque to outsiders. Due to this unique mode of communication, even the leading Vietnamese professors in linguistics or aeronautics could not decipher it, compelling them to interrogate captured pilots held in the Hoa Lo prison to gain the necessary insights. Back then, American pilots were highly trained and possessed a strong foundational knowledge, with most holding bachelor's degrees from prestigious universities, and some even holding master's degrees. They were well versed in all aspects before being deployed into combat. It was often remarked that if the weight of an American pilot were converted into gold, it would reflect the enormous cost of training such a pilot. Therefore, these pilots were a valuable source of information that Vietnamese intelligence could exploit for their military efforts. The difficulty at the time was that none of the American prisoners in Hoa Lo prison were B-52 pilots. They were mostly pilots of F-4s and F-105s. In the aviation field, B-52 pilots were considered to be of a higher caliber compared to pilots of other aircraft. However, Colonel Phan McLam understood that fundamentally, all aircraft share similar principles, and academically and in terms of combat skills, American pilots undoubtedly had more knowledge than their Vietnamese counterparts. Therefore, the information derived from these pilots was the best source of intelligence for Vietnam at that time. It's similar to consulting an appendectomy specialist about an eye problem rather than someone with no medical knowledge at all. At that time, American pilots were very stubborn and well-educated. Some were even war heroes from the Korean War, and thus they carried a strong sense of national pride. They were thoroughly trained, which meant they were quite aware of the interrogation tactics being used on them. Extracting information from them was extremely challenging due to their extensive background knowledge. As a result, they developed their own methods of communication with each other, such as tapping chopsticks or coughing in a natural manner during meals, all of which were methods of conveying messages to one another. Because of this, even if Vietnam asked, the American prisoners would never divulge information, no matter how friendly the questioning became or how much camaraderie was established, because American soldiers were thoroughly trained to resist such interrogation techniques. So, how was Vietnam able to obtain information from these pilots? It was all thanks to the incredibly humane treatment that the Vietnamese afforded them. The American pilots were treated exceptionally well, while Vietnamese officials were allocated RD 68 dong per day. American pilots received 1.6 dong per day for meals, and in special cases, up to 3.2 dong per day. They were allowed to engage in sports, read books in the sun, and listen to music and cultural programs. pilots who suffered injuries during their ejection were cared for by some of the best doctors in Vietnam, ensuring their quick recovery. Remarkably, during this period, Hoa Lo even housed a female prisoner who was a medical officer in the U.S. Army. The camp administrators had to go to great lengths to provide for her, purchasing items like underwear and sanitary pads, which were scarce in Vietnam at the time. They had to search extensively to find these items, and when purchasing them, they could not reveal that they were for a prisoner. Instead, they claimed they were gifts for their wives. This fostered a perception among locals that Vietnamese officials were quite affluent. During American holidays such as Thanksgiving, Christmas, and New Year's, the prison invited Pastor Bui Hoang Thu to conduct religious ceremonies for the Christian prisoners. The material and spiritual lives of the prisoners were well cared for. The opportunity for pilots to write and receive letters from their families back home made them appreciate life more than ever. They wrote to reassure their spouses that they were still alive and to tell their children that they had not been orphaned. This connection made them long to return home and see their loved ones after many years apart. This nurturing environment led almost all the American pilots to become more cooperative and provide information to Vietnam. They had so much to appreciate in their lives at that point that they did not want to lose that feeling. This made it much easier for Vietnam to gather information from them. The captured American pilots at Hoa Lo, having grown to love their lives in captivity, were very afraid of dying, afraid that a B-52 might end their lives. Therefore, they disclosed everything they knew about the B-52, including the training they had received, as they were acutely aware of its destructive power. Thanks to this humane policy, Vietnam learned that the prisoners at Hoa Lo were not just ordinary soldiers, but included highly experienced and senior officers. One had over 6,000 flying hours, and another had been a high-ranking commander. This valuable information, diligently and meticulously recorded by Colonel Phan Mac Lam, included detailed documentation on the capabilities, strengths, and weaknesses of the B-52, the basic formation of a B-52 squadron, in-flight refueling zones, and retreat routes. This extensive knowledge recorded by Colonel Lam was crucial for Vietnam's strategy and defense. Thanks to the information provided by American prisoners and the data collected by Vietnamese electronic intelligence, Vietnam was better equipped to handle the complexities of the B-52. However, this raises the question, was the US unaware that Vietnam was intercepting communications between their pilots? The answer is that the US intelligence was aware that their communications were being intercepted. Nonetheless, at the time, the US couldn't believe that Vietnamese intelligence had the capability to understand what was being intercepted. To the Americans, Vietnam was seen as a country where most people hadn't completed secondary education and lacked basic English skills. So the idea that they could understand the coded language used by US pilots seemed far-fetched. Yet, perhaps the US never considered that their own pilots might end up revealing crucial information. In those days, American pilots were often seen as noble officers, typically from wealthy and influential families. The US could afford to spend millions of dollars without hesitation, but the capture or death of a single soldier or pilot could lead to nationwide protests and opposition. For this reason, American pilots were a strategic asset for Vietnamese diplomacy, leading to meticulous security around the Hoa Lo prison. The area was heavily guarded with artillery and missiles because Vietnam feared a sudden US raid to rescue the pilots. This fear was based on a real incident. In 1970, there was a US raid on the Son Tai prison to rescue captured pilots, a story more thrilling than any escape movie. In 1970, US intelligence estimated that about 100 pilots were captured in North Vietnam. After some investigation, the US identified two potential prison locations, one in Mai Châu and another in Son Tai, but they weren't sure where the pilots were actually held. Therefore, the US employed various means to determine their location, including deploying the SR-71 reconnaissance aircraft to take photos and using infrared sensors to detect human presence in the prisons. At the Son Tai prison, American pilots had more freedom than usual, allowing them to engage in activities like bricklaying and digging. Due to their high level of education, they cleverly used these opportunities to signal each other and create visible messages like SOS with their movements, or arrange their clothes in a pattern resembling the letter K to signal aircraft above that they needed rescue. With such clear evidence, The US was able to confirm that their pilots were indeed held at Son Tai, leading to precise targeting for a rescue operation. Once the target was confirmed as the Son Tai prison, the US began to assess Vietnam's defense systems. They noted that although Vietnam had artillery and troops stationed around the area, these forces were dispersed and would take about 30 minutes to respond to an attack. This weakness was key to the planning of the US raid. The US calculated that a swift strike lasting only about 26 minutes would be sufficient to complete the rescue before Vietnamese forces could effectively respond. By the time Vietnamese troops could arrive, the operation would already be concluded, essentially leaving them as mere spectators to the aftermath. For the rescue operation at Son Tai prison, the US prepared meticulously. They constructed a replica of the Son Tai prison at full scale on American soil to allow their special forces to practice regularly. The helicopter pilots trained to fly at treetop level and follow winding paths to ensure precision in landing during the operation. The training was so secretive that the soldiers involved did not know the exact purpose of their exercises or the specific target in Vietnam. They were told only that they were practicing an assault on a typical Vietnamese village, and everything was classified to the highest level. Concerned about Soviet satellites potentially spotting their training mock-up and figuring out their plans, the US cleverly used simple materials like 204 wood for building walls and barracks, while the main gate and windows were either painted or cut out on canvas. Everything was designed to be easily assembled for practice and quickly disassembled to avoid detection during satellite activity. Training sessions were scheduled based on Soviet satellite operations, with practices conducted both day and night. The troops trained so thoroughly that they could operate the mock-up blindfolded, knowing the layout as well as the back of their hand. Everything was prepared in great detail. But whether the US could successfully rescue their prisoners, the story will continue in the next episode on the channel Legends of History. And with that, we'll conclude today's episode on historical discussions. Thank you all for your interest and support.